provided for $7 billion of COVID-19 relief cash grants to households across Guyana, $2 billion of one-off grants to public sector employees, and $1 billion in end-year bonuses to frontline workers in the health sector and the disciplined services. Budget 2020 reversed punitive and draconian tax measures, such as the value-added tax on electricity, water, and cellular phones, and it restored a subsidy on water charges for the elderly. Measures aimed at jump-starting economic activity included the removal of the value-added tax on exports and on machinery, equipment, and ATVs, all-terrain vehicles, for mining, forestry, agriculture, and manufacturing. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, corporate taxation was removed on private providers of education and healthcare, thereby incentivizing investment in these areas. An injection of $7 billion was also provided to recapitalize the sugar industry. Meanwhile, the resumption of the government's house lot distribution and land titling program, restoration of the $30 million limit on loans eligible for mortgage interest relief, and raising of the limit for low-income housing loans for corporate tax relief in the banking sector to $10 million, combined to stimulate a restart of activity in the construction sector and made home ownership affordable once again. And Mr. Speaker, the list of reliefs provided in Budget 2020 goes on. Mr. Speaker, in 2 short months, we will celebrate 55 years of political independence. As we approach this milestone, it is worthwhile to cast our eyes briefly backward over those 55 years, particularly at independent Guyana's economic history. That history indicates a succession of clearly distinguishable phases in the evolution of the Guyanese economy and a strikingly close correlation with the political history of the country. The first phase, from 1966 to 1992, was an era of state domination and economic decimation and left our country bankrupt. The second phase, from 1992 to 2015, was an era of economic restoration and reconstruction, with widespread renewal and expansion, returned our country to solvency and creditworthiness, and it put us firmly on a path to prosperity. Tragically, Mr. Speaker, these gains were sharply reversed during the third phase, between 2015 and 2020, a period of renewed state domination and rapid economic retrogression and degeneration, made all the worse towards the end by the devastating effects of COVID-19. And that period returned the country in the short space of 5 years to the brink of bankruptcy once again and a deep economic despair. Being acutely aware of this history, scarred by pre-1992 memories, and bruised and battered by the last 5 years, the people of Guyana chose as they did in 2020. In doing so, they made a resounding statement about the direction in which they would like to go at this critical juncture for our country. And most of those who were still not convinced by March 2020 certainly were by August 2020, having stared in utter disbelief at the events of the preceding 6 months. As we look back at 2020, if there is one lesson we must all have learned, it is the lesson of how interconnected and interdependent we are, both within our country and more widely as a global community. At home, we witnessed in 2020 how the actions of a tiny few could so easily have subverted the will of so many. In our quieter moments, Mr. Speaker, we must all reflect on where we might have ended up as a country if the will of the many did not prevail over the ill intentions of the few. Isolated from the rest of the world, condemned as a pariah, and consigned to the dust pile of tin pot dictatorships. Make no mistake of it, that tragic outcome would have affected all of us, not some of us. At the global level, 14 months ago, COVID-19 was a mystery illness affecting a few people far away in Wuhan City. Today, it has infected over 107 million persons across 223 countries and territories and killed nearly 2.4 million. Some of them, our neighbors and friends right here in Guyana. Not a single corner of the world has escaped the tentacles of COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, if that does not teach us a lesson of how interconnected and how interdependent we are, nothing will. With that historical context in mind, let us be clear. 2021 will not be an easy year. COVID-19 is still with us, and the need to keep our people safe and to keep the economy alive is still very present. While we've already started administering vaccines just a day or two ago, the speed of uptake and the time until herd immunity is achieved are still huge unknowns. Exactly when we will be returning to any semblance of normalcy is therefore far from certain. The matter is made worse by the fact that we are confronting these unknowns with limited fiscal resources, given the depletion and the plunder of the public treasury over the past 5 years. But recover we must. And recover we will. On a far more positive note, if we look beyond our immediate travails, it is important that we appreciate the magnitude of the moment at which we now stand. For generations, our foreparents have dreamt of a Guyana where they and their children can work, earn, live, and age comfortably, saving, uplifting themselves steadily, free of despair, full of hope, realizing aspiration after aspiration, and with no reason or yearning to be anywhere but here. This dream would have renewed itself at every major point in our country's history. Sadly, until now, and for a variety of reasons, this dream has remained elusive, despite the tremendous gains we made when we were last in office. Many remained hopeful, but some lost hope along the way. Contemplate now that ours is the generation who might finally realize this dream and the full magnitude of the moment we are in might better be appreciated. The dream that has eluded us as a country for generations can finally be realized, not in the far future, but by today's generation. Lest we be mistaken, this will not happen automatically. It will take bold and visionary, but careful and responsible leadership. The path to prosperity, and by this I mean not a fleeting glimpse of prosperity, but lasting and enduring prosperity, will unavoidably require careful charting and steady navigation. Important trade-offs will need to be made and balances struck, most significantly between immediate needs and longer-term considerations. Mr. Speaker, this is what the People's Progressive Party civic government offers. The vision to chart the course we need to take and the capability to get us there. Mr. Speaker, only yesterday, His Excellency President Irfan Ali, in his inaugural address to this National Assembly, spoke of the key word of his government being oneness, and he outlined his vision for one Guyana. There can be no more compelling philosophy for us than this concept of oneness. It is embodied in our national motto, and it must equally be embodied in all that we do. His Excellency also yesterday outlined a bold and exciting vision for our country across the entire spectrum of government policy, and including a number of specific targets by which his government will be held accountable. Guided by His Excellency's vision, as well as the People's Progressive Party civic manifesto on the basis of which we were elected to office, our agenda for transforming Guyana will bring tangible and demonstrable betterment to all Guyanese. With the implementation of this agenda, Guyana will be an unrecognizably different place in every positive respect in 5 years' time compared to where we are today. In keeping with His Excellency's vision, Budget 2021 seeks to achieve the following objectives for all Guyanese. 1, navigating COVID-19 for as long as it is around, keeping our population safe, containing further spread, treating those who are infected, providing vaccines as soon as they become available, and reopening the economy progressively and then fully when it is safe to do so. 2, ensuring a diversified and resilient productive sector by facilitating large-scale private investment in both traditional and new and emerging sectors, creating 50,000 jobs in the next 5 years, and promoting entrepreneurship at the medium and small business level. 3, initiating investment in catalytic and transformative infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, to ensure adequate supply at competitive cost, and transport infrastructure to improve international connectivity and unleash domestic production and productivity. 4, establishing world-class social services such as education and healthcare, so that these services are available to the domestic population, but also with a view to entering the international market for providing these services to a regional and global clientele. 5, improving the quality of public services and creating a conducive environment for doing business and interacting with government, including by deploying technology-based solutions, as well as reducing bureaucracy and red tape. And 6, ensuring respect for the Constitution and the rule of law, maintaining good governance, safeguarding access to justice, and the preservation of a safe and secure environment for all Guyanese and visitors to Guyana. With these objectives in mind, this budget ensures we recover as a country both from 2020 and from the last 5 years of trauma. It puts in place the policies needed to catalyze rapid economic growth in the near and medium term. And it lays the foundation needed to ensure that that growth is not transitory, but is sustainable for the longer term. Budget 2021 is therefore presented under the theme, A Path to Recovery, Economic Dynamism and Resilience. Mr. Speaker, I will now review the global and regional economic context. From the global economic standpoint, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a catastrophe like no other, causing an economic shock much worse and much more pervasive than the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Countries rich and poor, advanced and developing, have plunged into recessions as they adopted containment measures, with data now suggesting that some economies have started to recover. A less severe recession is estimated for 2020 than previously forecasted. Global output in 2020 is estimated to have contracted by 3.5%. This revised position reflects some easing in the second half, mostly in advanced economies, the United States and the Euro area, as well as in China after lockdowns were scaled back and government support measures were rolled out. Advanced economies who were able to deliver direct spending and liquidity support are estimated to have contracted by 4.9% in 2020. Similarly, the contraction of output in emerging market and developing economies is estimated at 2.4% in 2020. As previously forecasted, output in all countries in this group, except China, is estimated to have declined. Notably, growth in China is now estimated at 2.3% for 2020. In the Latin America and the Caribbean region, economic output is estimated to have contracted by 7.4%. Mr. Speaker, closer home, Caribbean economies felt the sharp effects of the pandemic as a result of their high dependency on tourism as well as domestic containment measures. Latest available data suggest that the tourism-dependent economies of the Caribbean are likely to have contracted by 9.9% in 2020, and individual countries in that group by as much as 20%. Even in the commodity exporting economies of the Caribbean, overall growth in 2020 is expected to have been in the vicinity of a paltry 0.6%. Mr. Speaker, as indicated earlier, COVID-19 is far from over, and much uncertainty remains. Following the 2020 contraction in global output, the world economy is expected to see some recovery in 2021. However, this must be regarded cautiously as the world continues to manage the public health situation and contain downside risks simultaneously. Global output is expected to grow in 2021 by 5.5%. Two key assumptions driving this outlook are the provision of additional policy support in some large economies as well as the expectation of a vaccine that would result in strengthened economic activity later in the year. Growth in advanced economies is therefore forecasted 4.3% in 2021. In the US and Japan, the 2021 growth outlook, projected at 5.1 and 3.1% respectively, can partially be attributed to fiscal stimulus measures introduced at the end of 2020. The 2021 outlook for the euro area at 4.2% incorporates lower activity at the end of 2020, combined with rising infections and reintroduced lockdowns. Recovery is also anticipated for the emerging market and developing economies group, which is expected to grow by 6.3%. Like the advanced economies, the recovery paths vary within this group, and with significant differentiation expected between China and the other economies, as China's containment measures and liquidity support appear to have facilitated a strong recovery. For Latin America and the Caribbean, growth of 4.1% is forecasted. But within the Caribbean, the recovery is expected to be protracted, with growth of 4% in the tourism-dependent economies and 3.8% in the commodity exporters. Mr. Speaker, as a commodity exporter, Guyana remains exposed to developments on the global commodity markets, and COVID-19 introduced much uncertainty in these markets, with mixed effects across the main commodities we export. The average world market price of rice was $497 per metric ton in 2020, 18.8% above the 2019 average. The average world market price for sugar was 28 US cents per kilogram in 2020, a 1.5% increase when compared with 2019. Global metal prices in 2020 were mixed when compared with 2019. The average price of gold in 2020 was $1,770 and 30 cents per troy ounce, 27.1% over 2019. The average price for aluminum was $1,704 per metric ton in 2020, 5% lower when compared with 2019. The average price of Brent crude oil was $42.30 per barrel in 2020, 33.9% lower when compared with 2019. Mr. Speaker, looking ahead, the world market prices for rice and sugar are projected to increase in 2021 by 0.3 and 2.3% respectively. However, gold and aluminum prices are projected to decline by 1.7 and 1.4% respectively. The average crude oil price is projected to increase by 4% in 2021, but remain below the 2019 average. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to developments in the domestic economy in 2020. Real gross domestic product. Mr. Speaker, at the time of Budget 2020, it was hoped that the budgetary allocations and measures introduced would help to curb the spread of COVID-19, allowing for a faster return to normalcy. However, it very quickly became apparent that infection levels were significantly higher than reported by our predecessors in office, reflecting the low level of testing. As a result, our government was forced to keep in place several emergency measures for much longer than anticipated, hampering the pace of recovery expected. at that time. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it has become evident that the shocks to our economy from the events of 2020, both the pandemic and the protracted general and regional elections, were far more severe and far more lasting than we anticipated. As a result, Mr. Speaker, our real GDP in 2020 is estimated to have grown by 43.5%, somewhat lower than previously expected, considering that 2020 was the first year over which we were an oil producer. More strikingly, Mr. Speaker, the non-oil economy is estimated to have contracted in 2020 by 7.3%. Sectoral performance: agriculture, forestry, and fishing. Mr. Speaker, in 2020, the agriculture, forestry, and fishing sector is estimated to have grown by 4.1%. This improved position is largely on account of growth in rice, other crops, and livestock, which more than offset contractions observed in sugar, forestry, and fishing. The sugar growing sector is estimated to have contracted by 3.7%, with production falling to a low of 88,868 tons. This was primarily due to a shortfall of more than 17,000 tons in the first crop, which in turn resulted from the protracted lack of capital investment in factories, which caused downtime and reduced the volume of sugar extracted from canes. Additionally, high rainfall in November and December resulted in the flooding of some fields and restricted access to canes. Mr. Speaker, the rice growing sector is estimated to have expanded by 4.8% in 2020. Paddy production reached 1,057,580 tons in 2020, 0.8% above the previous year. The increase was attributed to more hectares being harvested despite lower yields. The former improved by 4.4%, while the latter declined by 3.5% due to the incidence of various diseases that affected the second crop. With respect to the production of other crops, despite excessive rainfall in November and December, this sector is estimated to have grown by 6.6% in 2020. Notably, the COVID-19 pandemic would have resulted in increased demand for many fruits, particularly citrus. Like other crops, the livestock sector is also estimated to have grown in 2020, recording an increase of 5%. This was driven by poultry, egg, and beef production, which are estimated to have grown by 10.4%, 34.1%, and 3.4%, respectively. Mr. Speaker, the forestry sector is estimated to have contracted by 8.1%. The overall decline is primarily driven by an 11.8% decline in sawnwood production, reflecting the marked slowdown in construction activity in 2020. The fishing sector is projected to have contracted by 17.1%. This decline was largely as a result of fewer vessels going out to fish due to lower domestic and external demand stemming from the pandemic. Production was further limited by inclement weather, as well as an extension of the closed season for shrimp fishing from 8 weeks to 10 weeks. Extractive industries. Mr. Speaker, the mining and quarrying sector is estimated to have expanded by 303.7% in 2020. The overall growth above 2019 was driven by the emerging oil and gas and support services industry, which grew by 2,603.3% over the previous year, given that 2020 represented the first full year of the industry's operations. In contrast, a sharper than expected decline was observed for the gold subsector. Mr. Speaker, one of the large gold mining companies ceased production in July 2020 to facilitate a transfer of ownership and only resumed operations in November. As a result of this stoppage, as well as lower extraction by the other large company, the subsector contracted by 7.8%. The contraction in production by large-scale operators overshadowed the small and medium-scale miners, who declared 485,552 troy ounces in 2020, 8.3% higher than the previous year. Turning to the bauxite subsector, the stoppage of mining by one company, combined with lower global demand for bauxite and disruptions to supply chains, resulted in an estimated contraction of 41.2% in 2020. Mr. Speaker, the other mining subsector, which comprises diamond and sand mining and stone quarrying, is estimated to have contracted by a staggering 42.7% in 2020. Diamond declarations declined as a result of lower global demand for precious stones amid the global economic crisis caused by the pandemic. This resulted in lower prices. Domestically, as a result of the election's impasse, COVID-19 restrictions, and record high gold prices, less diamond mining activity was observed. The prevailing political and public health challenges also resulted in a significant reduction in construction activity, with public sector projects grinding to a halt for several months, resulting in reduced sand mining and stone quarrying. Mr. Speaker, the manufacturing sector is estimated to have contracted by 8.6% in 2020. Declines of 3.7%, 5.7%, and 10.8% were estimated for sugar, rice, and other manufacturing subsectors, respectively. Mr. Speaker, in 2020, the water supply and sewage sector is estimated to have increased by 8%. While this was partially due to new connections, it was also driven by increased sanitation activity as a result of the pandemic. Electricity supply is also estimated to have grown in 2020 by 1.2%. Construction. Mr. Speaker, as noted previously, construction activities were significantly lower than in 2019, largely as a result of restrictions put in place to curb the spread of COVID-19. While the relaxation of these measures in the second half of the year would have resulted in some improvement in the sector, it is still estimated to have contracted in 2020 by 6.3%. Mr. Speaker, the services sector is estimated to have contracted by 9.4% in 2020. The overall decline could be attributed primarily to contractions in wholesale and retail trade and transport and storage. These subsectors fell by 28.3% and 30.2% respectively, outweighing expansions in information and communication, real estate activities, public administration, and human health and social work, which grew by 5.5%, 0.3%, 1.2%, and 3% respectively. Balance of payments. The overall balance of payments recorded a surplus of $60.6 million in 2020, compared to a deficit of $48.9 million recorded in 2019. The current account recorded a deficit of $651.7 million in 2020, 76.9% lower than the deficit of $2,823.7 million in 2019. The difference between the actual outturn for 2020 and the forecast resulted from a larger than projected merchandise trade surplus. The merchandise trade account moved to a surplus of $514.8 million from a deficit of $2,473 million in 2019, reflecting the entry of oil exports into the balance of payments in 2020. This offset the lower than anticipated unrequited transfers and a higher than projected deficit on the services account. The net services account registered a deficit of $1,824.7 million in 2020, higher than the 2019 position of $892.5 million. This position was due to a larger than anticipated deficit on the non-factor services account by $216.2 million. In 2020, net payment for non-factor services increased by $907.6 million to $1.793 billion when compared to 2019. This resulted mainly from increased payments for business services. The surplus on the capital account was recorded at $720.9 million in 2020, lower than the $2,744.6 million in 2019. The shortfall resulted from higher outflows of private enterprises, also associated with the commencement of oil production. Net foreign direct investments amounted to $1.8243 billion in 2020. Mr. Speaker, under the capital account, the net non-financial public sector position moved to a deficit of $190.3 million compared to a surplus of $147.9 million in 2019. The 2020 deficit was mainly on account of lower than projected disbursements. The balance of payments surplus resulted in the Bank of Guyana increasing its external reserve position to $680.6 million, equivalent to 2 months of import cover at end 2020. Mr. Speaker, the money supply expanded by 13.7% to $521 billion in 2020 when compared with 2019. The outturn in 2020 was attributed to increases in both narrow and quasi-money, which grew by 20.5% and 5.6% respectively. The growth in narrow money was on account of increases in the currency in circulation and demand deposits, which grew by 30.3% and 13.7% respectively. These increases more than offset the decline of 29.6% in cashier's checks and acceptances. The growth in quasi-money resulted from an increase in savings deposits of 11.1%, despite a decline in time deposits of 25.9%. Mr. Speaker, in 2020, net domestic credit by the banking system expanded by 15.9% to $343.9 billion when compared with 2019. This position resulted from increased credit to both the private and the public sectors. Net private sector credit grew by 2.4% to $259.8 billion on account of an increase in credit to all sectors with the exception of manufacturing, which contracted by 17.8%. Credit to the agriculture, mining, and quarrying, services, households, real estate mortgage loans, and other sectors were higher by 3.2, 7.3, 7.7, 1.7, 3.7, and 7.7% respectively. This reflects the decision to lower the reserve requirement ratio from 12 to 10% for the period from August 24th to December 31st, 2020, in keeping with an agreement between the central bank and the commercial banks in relation to COVID-19 relief measures. Total reserves deposited with the Bank of Guyana increased by 42.5% to $125.6 billion due to the reduction in the reserve requirement to encourage private sector credit. Reserves in excess of minimum requirement amounted to $75.1 billion at end December 2020. Prices and income. Mr. Speaker, the 12-month inflation rate at December 2020 was recorded at 0.9%, mainly as a result of lower energy prices, which offset higher food prices, largely driven by higher prices of meat, fish and eggs, and vegetable products. Interest rates. Mr. Speaker, the interest rate remained low throughout 2020. The small savings rate declined by 5 basis points in December 2020 when compared with December 2019 to reach 0.91%, while the commercial bank weighted average lending rate fell by 22 basis points to 8.96%. The 182-day Treasury bill yield increased to 1% from 0.89%, while the 364-day Treasury bill yield remained unchanged at 1%, resulting from the competitive bidding for these instruments. The 91-day Treasury bill also remained unchanged at 1.54%. Incomes. Mr. Speaker, in 2020, recognizing the hardship of COVID-19 and following the much delayed change in government in August 2020, this People's Progressive Party civic government provided amounts totaling $7 billion for every household to receive relief in the form of an unconditional cash transfer of $25,000. This government has also been clear and unwavering in our commitment to place our frontline responders first as we combat the pandemic. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, they were first in line to receive the COVID-19 vaccines as they arrived yesterday. In this regard, Mr. Speaker, we put $1.1 billion in the hands of over 19,000 health workers and members of the disciplined services. Additionally, a one-off payment was made to all public sector employees, benefiting more than 60,000 employees and putting almost $2 billion in the hands of these employees. Mr. Speaker, while some countries around the world reduced working hours and salaries for their workers as part of their pandemic response, this government retained all public servants at full pay, while allowing a rotational work system and work-from-home systems where applicable to mitigate disease transmission. Fiscal position. Mr. Speaker, the balance on the non-financial public sector after grants amounted to a deficit of $91.8 billion. This deficit is equivalent to 9.6% of GDP at the end of 2020 and is mainly attributed to a shortfall of $2.9 billion in revenue, offset against the contraction in total expenditure of $1.3 billion. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, grants fell short by $939.7 million. Central government. At the end of 2020, the operations of the central government resulted in a deficit of $90.5 billion, 9.4% of GDP. The deficit was primarily as a result of higher than anticipated expenditure requirements. Central government current revenue for 2020 totaled $227.4 billion. Tax collection accounted for 96% of this revenue, $218.3 billion. The increase in tax revenue above the 2020 level, above the 2020 estimate rather, was the result of higher than projected collections from internal revenue and excise taxes, which grew by $6 billion and $1.9 billion respectively. Internal revenue was higher on account of larger than expected collections from private sector corporation tax and PAYE, which were $3.7 billion and $1.3 billion above the forecast. The increase in excise tax collections above the budget projections is mainly due to the higher than anticipated collections from the importation of fuel products and motor vehicles. In contrast, Mr. Speaker, collections from VAT were $2.8 billion lower than the projection on account of lower collections from both imported goods and domestically supplied goods of $2.4 billion and $368.3 million, respectively. And it would be recalled, Mr. Speaker, that this government provided extensive relief on VAT as a priority in the 2020 budget. Yep. Similarly, customs and trade tax collections were below the 2020 forecast by $1.3 billion, largely attributed to lower collections of import duties. Non-tax revenue totaled $9.1 billion, lower than projected as a result of lower dividends received from the non-financial public enterprises. Mr. Speaker, central government expenditure for 2020 totaled $325.5 billion, $5.2 billion above the allocation provided for in Budget 2020. When compared with the Budget 2020 estimates, non-interest expenditure was $1.6 billion higher than expected on account of larger outlays on other goods and services and transfer payments. The increase in other goods and services was mainly on account of the payment by this government of $6 billion of electricity arrears inherited from the previous government and owed by various government agencies to the detriment of the finances of the Guyana Power and Light Incorporated. The growth in transfer payments arose from the COVID-19 relief cash grant, which we have rolled out across the country. Mr. Speaker, interest payments were $394.9 million lower than the projection, and capital expenditure reached $76.1 billion at the end of 2020. The overall deficit of the public enterprises at the end of 2020 was $1.3 billion. Public debt management. Mr. Speaker, this People's Progressive Party civic government's track record, established and so amply illustrated during our previous tenure in office, our track record of prudent debt management is well established and has been amply illustrated. We endeavor to preserve that track record by contracting financing and meeting debt service obligations at the lowest possible cost within acceptable risk parameters. This approach would engender the continued sustainability of Guyana's total public and publicly guaranteed debt, which amounted to $2,592.2 million at end December 2020. Of this amount, total public debt comprised $2,589.8 million, while total publicly guaranteed debt comprised $2.4 million. Mr. Speaker, of note, this is the first year that our debt coverage has been expanded to include publicly guaranteed debt, providing a more complete picture of our debt position. This is yet more testimony to this People's Progressive Party Civic's government's commitment to transparency and accountability. Mr. Speaker, at the end of December 2020, the ratio of total public and publicly guaranteed debt to GDP was 47.4%. Total public debt at end December 2020 was 53.3% higher than at December 2019, mainly due to the inclusion of the large central government gross overdraft with the Bank of Guyana, accumulated under the previous administration, but which was previously not reflected as part of the domestic debt stock. This move is intended to regularize and accurately reflect significant liabilities accumulated over the last 5 years and to restore the integrity of Guyana's fiscal accounts. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, all outstanding liabilities totaling about $67.5 million or about 14.1 billion Guyana dollars under a government-guaranteed bond issued in May 2018 by the National Industrial and Commercial Investments Limited, NISIL, under the previous administration, were classified or are classified now as domestic debt due to the fact that the government, this government, was required to meet debt service obligations under this bond in 2020. It would be recalled, Mr. Speaker, that that bond was issued with a full and ironclad government guarantee. In 2020, Mr. Speaker, total public debt service payments amounted to $92.3 million, an increase of 9.3% compared to the preceding year, on account of higher domestic debt service costs. Total domestic debt service payments in 2020 amounted to $16.1 million, more than twice the 2019 figure of $6.3 million, due to the need for government to meet the debt service obligations under the said NISIL bond. Conversely, Mr. Speaker, external debt service payments shrank by 2.5% in 2020 to $76.2 million, mainly due to the completion of repayments under a rescheduled debt to Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Speaker, early in 2021, indeed just a few days ago, government moved to increase the external and domestic debt ceilings from $400 billion to $650 billion and from $150 billion to $500 billion respectively, both for purposes of regularizing the outstanding liabilities inherited from our predecessors in office and also to accommodate new financing. We recognize that an increase, particularly in the level of domestic debt, is likely to materialize in the short term, but will be actively examining ways in which to contain this indebtedness going forward. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to sectoral vision and plans, the agenda for 2021 and beyond. Macroeconomic outlook. Mr. Speaker, despite the ambition of our development agenda and our intention to roll it out in the shortest possible time, we will do so within a macroeconomic framework that ensures that we remain competitive and that addresses issues of both stability and sustainability. In this regard, we will remain ever mindful of the need to avoid the pitfalls that have beset many new producers of oil and gas and many resource-rich countries, including Dutch disease. We will safeguard the fiscal and debt sustainability that we've worked so hard to achieve by prudent contracting of new financing, careful targeting and management of government expenditure, strengthened revenue administration, and ensuring that the fiscal deficit is managed in a way that minimizes any risk of crowding out credit to the private sector. The task before us is to ensure steady repair of the public finances from the parlous state in which we inherited them, while at the same time financing our aggressive development agenda. Mr. Speaker, we anticipate high rates of real economic growth in the immediate term, reflecting the ramping up of oil production, but moderating into the medium and longer term. We will ensure that those high rates of growth are accompanied by policies designed to minimize supply-side constraints to avoid the risk of overheating. We aim to ramp up adequate levels of external reserves, ensure exchange rate stability, as well as interest rate stability, and ensure low levels of inflation. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the low-carbon development strategy. It is no secret that Guyana continues to face disproportionate exposure to the effects of climate change given our low-lying coastal plain. At the same time, we make a disproportionate contribution to the global fight against climate change, given our pristine standing rainforests. This has not changed, notwithstanding that we've become an oil-exporting country. Our vulnerability to the effects of climate change and our desire to respond as a proactive participant in the search for solutions rather than lament as victims led to the vision of the low-carbon development strategy. The LCDS, as it is known, was a groundbreaking forest partnership agreement with Norway, the first for a developing country and the third largest agreement of its kind anywhere in the world. This agreement provided for Guyana to earn payments for climate services up to $250 million over a 5-year period. Mr. Speaker, when the APNU AFC government came into office in 2015, they squandered whatever funds were available and brought the release of the rest of the funds already earned by Guyana to a grinding halt. This culminated in the last payments from Norway being suspended. On top of this lost opportunity, a successor Guyana-Norway agreement for the period from 2015 to 2020 never materialized. Almost $30 million for existing projects has not been disbursed. More than $135 million that was earned by Guyana under this arrangement is sitting in bank accounts outside our economy. The Amila Falls hydropower project, which would have used $80 million of LCDS financing to leverage hundreds of millions of dollars of private investment by major international investors, was derailed. And the opportunity to grow our payments from forest climate services after 2015 was never taken. Mr. Speaker, together, this is one of the most shameful economic legacies of the APNU AFC government. And it falls to this People's Progressive Party civic government to repair that damage. We will do this in 3 ways. First, in today's budget, we are taking steps to unblock the more than $135 million that had not been released for allocation into projects. These resources will be invested primarily in renewable energy projects and to strengthen the agencies involved in regulating the sector, such as the Guyana Forestry Commission, as well as to advance ongoing projects, such as the Amerindian Land Titling Project, sustainable land management, and on ICT access for hinterland, poor, and remote communities. Second, we are looking ahead and starting work to assess the emerging international markets for forest climate services. It is believed that these markets can contribute 75% of needed offsets to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, and global interest is growing. This is exactly the message that Guyana and other forest countries have been championing for over a decade, while pointing out that in developing countries in particular, all societies need to rapidly grow low-carbon opportunities if they are to diversify their economies away from traditional development paths. Finally, later this year, we will prepare an expanded LCDS to take into account the opportunities and challenges that have emerged since the strategy was first produced. We will expand it into a comprehensive development strategy. Needless to say, this will incorporate the fact that we are now an oil producer. In the updated LCDS, this government will set out how Guyana can achieve the national transformation that the PPPC manifesto speaks of, while also participating in the global economic transition that will take place in coming decades. True to the original vision of the LCDS, Guyana can lead the way in meeting this challenge. Our next objective, Mr. Speaker, is the promotion of a diversified, resilient, and competitive productive sector: oil and gas. Mr. Speaker, since the announcement of the oil discoveries back in 2015, this government has been unwavering in its position that Guyana must utilize these resources responsibly and transparently to catalyze development and create opportunities for all Guyanese. Since we assumed office, we have come to find that the capacity for management of the oil and gas sector remains severely underdeveloped to ensure that resource extraction is efficient and such